Okay, so hi, I'm Naomi Andrews, and I am wearing two hats today, both as chair and commentator on this panel, Sentiment and Statecraft, Political and Emotional Regimes in France, 1789-1848. I'm going to introduce our speakers as they come to speak, and that's part of the concession to taping. So, our first speaker is Adrian O'Connor. Adrian is assistant professor of history at the University of South Florida in St. Petersburg. He's the author of several recent articles on education and democracy in revolutionary France, including Between Monarch and Monarchy, The Education of the Dauphin and Revolutionary Politics, which appeared in French history, and Nature, Nurture, and the Social Order, Imagining Lessons and Lives for Women in Ancien Régime France. That appeared in French Politics, Culture, and Society. Adrian has just completed his first book manuscript entitled In Pursuit of Politics, Education and Revolution in 18th Century France. And the paper he's presenting today, Designing a Sentimental Regime in Revolutionary France, 1789-1791, is among the initial forays into his next project, tentatively entitled Fraternité and the French Revolution, Affective Anti-Factionalism and the Invention of Modern Politics.
Thank you, Naomi, and thank you all of you for finding your way down to the basement and not detouring into the steakhouse. Perhaps that was appealing. All right, so I'd like to start by recalling one of the more peculiar episodes in the history of the French Revolution and of revolutionary politics, the so-called Kiss of La Morette. Many of you are presumably familiar with this, but for those who are not, it's always fun to retell. On the morning of July 7th, 1792, Antoine Adrien Lamorette and his colleagues in the Legislative Assembly had a daunting agenda before them. They were discussing Lafayette's recent political and military maneuvers, reviewing and approving provisions for additional military units engaged in the increasingly disastrous war effort, and assessing what Georges Cusson considered an unconstitutional politicization of the judiciary in Pas-de-Calais. They were also wrestling with the fallout from the storming of the Tuileries on June 20th, the distrust dividing members of the various legislative factions, and the social tensions that accompanied rising bread prices. Facing enemies foreign and domestic, real and perceived, they were understandably anxious as they struggled to marshal the legal, institutional, and emotional resources to deal with apparent crises on all fronts. And then Lamorette interjected, offering an ingenious solution. The deputies should embrace one another. The myriad problems facing France could be resolved, he said, if only the deputies would swear an oath of eternal fraternity and sincerely embrace one another in a spirit of affection, devotion, and common purpose. Fraternal love would vanquish the enemies of the patrie and would save the Legislative Assembly. As remarkable as his suggestion seems, more remarkable still was the response from his fellow deputies, who suspended their discussions, embraced one another, demanded that Lamorette's speech be printed and distributed throughout the nation, and then they and many spectators in the assembly cried, "The nation is saved." Everything we write should have that grand effect. So what should we make of this moment, this kiss of Lamorette? It's certainly a beguiling episode. Robert Darnton famously described it as an episode that invites us to attend the play of passion across the whole range of the human comedy in a world that is no more. More immediately to the point today, it also invites us to rethink the role of emotion in revolutionary politics and why Lamorette and his colleagues would turn to fraternity at such a decisive moment, what they thought this embrace might do to save them. Of course, the Kiss of Lamorette is far from alone in the register of dramatic, fraternal, and sentimental outbursts after 1789. They were, after a time, seemingly everywhere. To cite just one other particularly famous example, one William Reddy describes as a perfect jewel of sentimentalism, of Jacobin sentimentalism, I should clarify. There's Joseph Fouché's August 1793 letter to the Committee of Public Safety about affairs in Clemency, which included the following tale. I quote, "The hellish demon who was tearing into one part of the Republic had managed to divide citizens, friends, brothers, spouses, and their unfortunate children. Sulphurous emanations enveloped the town. Then, in an instant, they were consumed by the flame of liberty. All the citizens came together and embraced one another. Light-hearted songs, dances, patriotic sounds of a warlike music artillery salvos, prolonged cries of "Long live the mountain, long live the Constitution," announced to all the neighboring communes the happy festival of a general and fraternal reunion around the tree of liberty. Here, as in Lamorette's Kiss, we see fraternity's supposed power to avert political catastrophe, to reestablish emotional bonds, and to overcome potentially violent divisiveness. We see emotional and political magic at work. Studies of fraternity in the French Revolution often situate such episodes within a larger political culture defined by festivals, oath-swearing ceremonies, and other such spectacles of political unity. They then see those invocations of fraternity and related sentiments as part of an attempt to establish a polity without political conflict. The embrace of fraternal and civic sentimentality seems, as Mona Ozouf wrote of the revolutionary festivals, evidence of the false view of itself that the revolution inherited from its fascination with utopia. But what if Lamourette meant something more prosaic, more mundane, and less utopian than we've supposed? Reading his speech in its entirety suggests that there are perhaps reasons to suspect this. Before calling upon his fellow deputies to embrace one another, he explained, quote, "There is no schism as irredeemable as that between virtue and vice, or between honest and dishonest men, who cannot be brought together to achieve something honorable and useful to the community. But among honest men, it is good to find disagreement when they are debating how to assure the prosperity and freedom of an empire. Their disagreements will not produce passion or hatred because they value one another, because there remains among them a unity of purpose, and because they share a sense of integrity and innocence. And because they are sure one of the other, the fair-minded and moderate airing of their diverse views will recall them, by their probity and honor, to that sacred sanctuary where virtue discovers itself." Lamourette's call for a fraternal embrace offered not just an emotional response to the catastrophic situation in which the deputies found themselves, but also a vision of politics in which debate and discord naturally accompanied attempts to settle difficult and important points of disagreement. In retrospect, the episode certainly seems utopian and naive. It occurred just 4 days before the deputies would declare la patrie en danger, and just 5 weeks before the constitutional monarchy was overthrown. But at the time, Lamourette's speech was in fact neither. He did not deny the severity of the crises facing the Assembly and the nation, nor did he dismiss the divide among the deputies as unimportant. Instead, he provided an opportunity to situate their disputes within the context of legitimate political practice. It was not contrary to reason or nature that they were arguing with one another, and their situation was not hopeless if they could retain or recapture a sense of shared purpose and just a modicum of good faith. Fraternity was not an antidote to discord, but a necessary condition for debate. Following Lamourette's suggestion that fraternity was necessary for the practical work of collective self-governance among people of honest intentions, I would like to propose that we think about fraternity not just as a rhetoric of political enthusiasm or a normative instrument of ideological coercion, though it was each of these at various times, but also as a conceptual underpinning to the revolutionaries' political logic, as a salve that was supposed to mediate but not preempt political disputes and debates, and as an instrument to which the revolutionaries turned in response to deep-seated and reasonable anxieties about political society. In short, fraternity was not just an affective and abstract ideal, but a cultivated reflex that the revolutionaries sought to nurture and draw upon in the design of new political and administrative institutions and practices. The revolutionaries' embrace of a fraternal language of civic sentimentality came at the end of a century in which the sources and stability of the social order were subjected to increasing amounts of scrutiny and suspicion. The resulting anxieties became interwoven with concerns about the nature of commercial society, perceived tension between public and private lives, and insecurities about the dynamics of social exchange and public trust. In short, as Michael Sonnencher and Istvan Hant have each noted, sociability had become political. It seemed to many that the emergent social, political, and economic order was one in which the pursuit of interest threatened to atomize society, and with that, to either tear society apart or reduce it to a merely transactional, and so conditional and circumstantial, aggregate of persons. Not only were these thinkers skeptical of such a society's ability to weather a crisis, but they feared that the corrosive effects of what Kant called unsocial sociability would degrade societies even in times of peace and prosperity. These concerns were both ubiquitous and understandable in the first years of the French Revolution. The liberalization of the press, the embrace of a participatory and to a point contestatory politics, along with the need to simultaneously invent and legitimize new political institutions and practices, intertwined with ongoing economic crises and contentious disputes over economic reforms, meant that the interests and opinions of large swaths of the population would come into very public conflict with one another. In light of such foreseeable contestation, the revolutionaries' fear of the consequences if fraternity were not achieved seemed eminently reasonable. But what was fraternity, or civic sentiment more broadly, supposed to do in the face of these disagreements? Reddy and others have drawn attention to sentimentalism's role in delegitimizing dissenting voices and vilifying political opponents. The contests of political society seem to run afoul of a univocality demanded by a worldview in which, I quote Reddy, goodness was natural, and any deviation from goodness appeared unnatural. On this view, the later and troublingly frequent proclamations of fraternité ou la mort seem horribly apt. But ou la mort was juxtaposed with many terms and phrases. Ultimately, it tells us more about the rhetoric of political anxiety in the early republic than it does about fraternity or the role of sentiment in revolutionary politics. Views such as Reddy's prefigure fraternity and related sentiments as a tourniquet desperately applied to the body politic, preventing us from recognizing their anticipated function in a system of public politics. The picture is rather different if we note that the conceptual space occupied by fraternity had anticipated rather than responded to political disagreements. And revolutionaries sought to establish an ameliorative reservoir of fraternal sentiment because they recognized and anticipated that French society would have divisions, and these divisions would be public. Now, fraternity seemed to offer an escape from the worst consequences of this publicity. Its power to do so stemmed from the promise of reestablishing a link between political association and a sentimentalized humanity, of expanding the affective bonds of familial or elective associations to include fellow citizens and even the state itself. Approaching the problem of fraternity and civic sentiments with this in mind allows us to recognize that fraternity's institutional and social function was not to prevent disputes from arising, but to prepare the body politic to sustain itself when points of fundamental division arose, and when political passions threatened to become destructively inflamed. In light of this, we should re-examine fraternity's place in the political imagination of the Revolution with greater attention to its anticipated influence on how citizens engage with one another and with the larger society on a day-to-day basis. In other words, we should focus on fraternity's place in the world rather than its expression on the festival grounds. Doing so allows us to appreciate that the sentimental man-citizen, whose existence underwrote so many revolutionary ambitions, was a practical as well as an ideological project. To note that civic sentiments were not imagined at a remove from material concerns and practical activities. Instead, they were supposed to be both visible in and reinforced by such activities in ways that were materially relevant to people's lives. As Sarah put it in her book on friendship and politics after the Revolution, fraternity was a way to imagine national unity and to understand how the men and women of France could overcome social divisions. Fraternity was the reflexive way one treated others. This last phrase is particularly suggestive because reflexive behaviors are by their nature not reserved for extraordinary circumstances or special occasions, such as festivals or oath-swearing ceremonies. They're dispositional and unremarkable. They're part of the interpersonal currency of everyday life. To better illustrate this point, I want to turn in the remaining few minutes to the revolutionary proposals regarding poor relief, a project that was imagined as both constitutive and reflective of the social and political order the revolutionaries hoped would emerge from revolution. Now, in the initial abstract for this paper, I, with customary and foolish ambition, proposed examining the reforms of education and the judiciary along with those for poor relief. We'd be here for about 3 days. Now, either of the others would serve well, and perhaps even better, as the educational institutions were being imagined to both nurture and reflect new social and political dynamics, and the judiciary was being redesigned to mediate conflict, and it was hoped resolve disputes without resorting to the conflict of a trial. But there's something particularly apt about poor relief for rethinking the relationship between fraternity and civic sentiment on the one hand, and political or social institutions on the other. As 18th century thinkers came to view poverty as a social and systemic problem, that is, as a contingent and social fact rather than a consequence of providential or moral necessity, the relationship between the poor and the body politic was subject to increasingly critical re-examination. This, in turn, fed into and off of new views of the state and its role in society, helping the question of poor relief to emerge during the Revolution as a bridge between what are often described, back to Rousseau, as aesthetic and fiscal conceptions of the state, between sentiment and statecraft. As Michael Sonnencher notes in a recent essay on Rousseau and his legacy in revolutionary and romantic thought, with Rousseau, contingency, not sociability, was the hallmark of humanity's origins. Sociability came late. This allowed sociability to, and I'm quoting Sonnencher, to turn into something like a synonym for the idea of a civil religion, or in more ordinary language, the norms of civic life, and in this guise, to become part of a parallel set of historical accounts, centered either on states, governments, and taxes, or on culture, civilization, and aesthetics, but with the concept of perfectibility forming an analytic and historical bridge between the two. Like perfectibility, or better still, as part of a program of social regeneration that was related and indebted to ideas of perfectibility, new ways of thinking about poor relief sought to capitalize on the intertwining of sentimental citizenship and the social functions of the state. As part of this program of political regeneration, the deputies of the constituent and then legislative assemblies established the Comité de Mendicité and the Comité des Séquoias to review and pursue remedies to the problem of indigence. The resulting proposals are noted often for their failure and for the proposed centralization and nationalization of efforts that had previously been handled by local, clerical, or private charities. The problem of poor relief is notable for another reason, though: the transformation that took place during the early years of the Revolution in the civic rationale for assisting those in extreme poverty. The decades before the French Revolution saw increased and increasingly critical attention paid to the problem of poverty and the efficacy or inefficacy of the existing institutions. The institutions of charitable assistance and poor relief had traditionally been administered and controlled by the church, an arrangement that reinforced the perceived link between charitable giving and the demands of Christian virtue, good works, and salvation. After the mid-18th century, however, this system was increasingly criticized for the inadequacy of its resources and the inefficiency of its operations. As Alan Forrest notes, this was part of a larger change in how social relations and social circumstances were imagined and understood, and, quote, with an increasing tendency to view charity as a purely economic activity rather than as one imbued with Christian significance and expectations of salvation, the practical effects of clerical almsgiving came to be more critically scrutinized. Divorcing poor relief from the dynamics of sin and salvation was particularly important because it made poverty a social and economic condition rather than a moral or spiritual one. And so it undermined the belief that the lot of the poor was related to their wickedness or human frailty. Writers, and this is Forrest, writers no longer accepted that it was a sin to be poor, but preferred to see poverty as one of the necessary concomitants of economic change. After 1789, this meant that the poor, of whom there were an overwhelming number, could be recognized as members of the national community, members to whom both fellow citizens and the state had personal and ethical obligations. The result was a dialectical transformation of thinking about the poor and the problem of poor relief. The condition of poverty had been separated from the dynamics of sin and salvation and reimagined as a secular and social phenomenon. The theological bond between beggar and philanthropist had been severed. But the result was a reinvestment of poor relief with civic and sentimental significance. There was, as Catherine Lynch puts it, a reemergence of a civic rationale, or civic vision, of poor relief, one that culminated in Jacobin efforts in 1793-94 to use poor relief to create ties of fraternal solidarity within the nation and to involve citizens as a whole in the task of relieving their poor brothers. This sense that the affective bonds tying individual citizens to the state and to one another could be mobilized to address the plight of the poor was not a Jacobin invention. It was evident already in the autumn of 1789 when citizens presented themselves before the National Assembly to offer patriotic gifts to the nation and to the nation's poor. It was reinforced in the May 1790 decision by the Comité de Mendicité to embrace a national model of publicly funded poor relief, and it survived, at least as an ideal and an inspiration, through the period of Jacobin rule, after which it was disavowed and its institutions dismantled by the Thermidorians. These poor relief efforts, like so many revolutionary ambitions during these years, were doomed by economic crises and political instability, especially after the start of the war in April 1792. As Rebecca Spang writes regarding the depreciation of the assignat, financial instability and political collapse fed into one another, a vicious cycle that applied to the establishment of new political and social institutions just as it did new forms of currency. Despite their failure, though, these efforts offer us valuable insight into the ambitions for social and political regeneration that emerged in and after 1789. What is remarkable in the case of poor relief is the intentional interweaving of civic sentiment, state functions, and social institutions. Forrest aptly notes that while many of the changes in poor relief undertaken after 1789 resemble proposals from the late Ancien regime, it was only after 1789 that the logics of civic association, political legitimacy, fraternal care, and state responsibility became intimately related in ways that made ambitious action on such plans possible. By the time post-Thermidorian legislators disowned these efforts, the politics of fraternity and the relationship between civic sentiment and political engagement had been transformed by the experience of the Terror and lost in the difficult process of differentiating between Jacobin excess and legitimate revolutionary ambition. By then, fraternity had been marked by terror, and its role as tourniquet had replaced its value as a social and political balm. By then, Lamourette was dead, and his reassuring vision of political debate and disagreement had passed into the annals of revolutionary naivete and utopian enthusiasm. And yet my sense is that there's something to be gained by resisting the sort of teleology that would see the enthusiasm of 1789 through the lens of Thermidorian skepticism. Focusing on fraternity's practical work, rather than philosophical dimensions, reminds us that the work of regeneration was more opportunistic and institutional than utopian. It also permits us to more coherently articulate and analyze the relationship between the revolution's political concepts and its institutional ambitions, to situate the perceived need to regenerate French society amidst 18th century concerns about civic and social relations, and to appreciate the interplay of ambition and anxiety that characterized revolutionary politics. It might, in short, help us to better grasp the allure of Lamourette's kiss and to understand how politics came to seem possible in revolutionary France. Thank you.